Williamson was the head of the troops at the Moravian Massacre. And two of the Indians that were there escaped came back to this area. And the Moravians were Christian Delaware Indians. There was an Indian around here that had a village. His name was Captain Pike. He hated the Americans with a passion. And any excuse that he could use to declare war on the Americans, that was great with him. So Captain Pike used this as more or less a war cry when they found out that the Americans were coming this way. And Crawford had he was uneasy because he knew that this was going to be an expedition that they wanted to keep silent. But from the time that they left the area that they left, the Indians knew it because they had spies out, they had scouts out, and they scouted them the whole way back. They knew where they were every day. So Crawford was kind of at odds end at that time, even to begin with. Crawford brought his troops here. Part of them was 13th Virginia. A lot of militia. They had to have their own horses. Some of them didn't. General Irvin gave him a surgeon, Dr. John Knight. And Dr. Knight was one of the regulars. There was a Rose that was a regular. He was actually a Russian that was over here fighting for the Americans and ended up going back to Russia. But when they got here, they had several officers with them. One of them was Major McClellan, names that everybody, had read about. And Crawford came to this area. He got outside of town, and it was 1782, 230 years ago. And they stopped at Reaper's Bottom, one place they stopped. They come up here and they stop, as my diorama depicts, where the Elks would be right here today, and US 30. And there's a spring there, an Indian spring. It was taken out after they put a sewer line in on 4th Street, and they took that spring out and it dried up because it dried up. But Crawford's troops stopped there too, unbeknownst to what his dim future would be. Now, when they got out to the area that they fought, 53 was used. Today's State Route 53 was more or less like a trail that went up to the lakes. And it was used extensively during the War of 1812 when they had Fort 3 here in Upper Sandusky, which is another historic event that Upper Sandusky was associated with. When Crawford stopped and he got out towards what they call Battle Island today, they stopped and had a conference during the afternoon, and they talked about, how some of the scouts felt very uneasy about not finding any Indians. They found a couple Indian towns that were abandoned. That's a bad sign. So they decided that they were just going to go on for probably the rest of the afternoon and then turn around. Well, that's where, I should say, all hell broke loose. They sent a few scouts ahead, and in the area where the Indians were, they had an ambush set up. And if you go out to Battle Island today and look at that, as you're facing the monument and off to your left is an area of open field. That was a marsh area at that time, very marshy. I mean, you couldn't hardly get through that area. And if you look off to the right, and like it would be north and to the right, there's a ravine down in there that is said to where the Indians hid. Now, Crawford's scouts got out into it was a grove of trees, and that's why they call it Battle Island. It was like an island of trees. And I've read in a lot of books that eventually those trees were taken down and plowed over, and you can't even know, it's unrecognizable today as where that area was. It's just accounts that I read. But as they got into the tree line, there were a few Indians in the tree line, and that started the spring ashore. So Crawford's troops rushed up to the area. This was on June 4th of 1782. Now, while the battle was going on, they took the grove of trees and they had cover. There was a lot of prairie grass out in the area, and they said it was high enough that a man could walk in it, and the Indians would come up and try to get close. And the battle was a heated battle. I mean, it was the temperature, you're in June, real hot temperature, and if anybody's been around muskets, when they fire those, the acrid smoke that comes out of them, and the heat, they always talk about the heat of the battle. When I was in Vietnam and we had a firefight, you felt the heat. And we had modern weapons, but it was still hot. And you were doing things that you just didn't think about. Well, Crawford's men, you know, they fought a pretty good fight, and they actually were winning the battle on the 4th. And on the 5th, they were going to, that morning, they were going to just kind of charge into the Indians and try to disperse them. Well, in the meantime, they noticed that they were fighting against some redcoats. Now, this makes this battle actually a part of the Revolution, because the fighting had ended in the east, it didn't end in the west. And it wasn't the last battle. There's another battle before this battle, but there's a couple, like 2 or 3 battles here in Ohio that were, they called the last battles of the War of the Revolution. Now, the British that Crawford fought against were Butler's Rangers. And they had a Captain Caldwell that brought them down. When Crawford saw that they were Butler's Rangers and that they were fighting against British regulars, they decided they had a real brief get-together with the officers, and they decided they were going to wait till that night to try to back out of there. At that time, it was pretty late because the Shawnees had got here. They had Mingos, several different tribes sent reinforcements, plus the British. The British brought a couple grasshopper cannons and a small mortar with them. So Crawford knew that, you know, this was going to be bad, and so they decided they were just going to try to get out. This is where a lot of the confusion of war happens. On the 5th, after the battle that night, they decided they were going to try to go out the back side. And several of the troops went in the wrong direction. They got out into the marshlands with their horses and got stuck. They kind of split up. Crawford at that time was with the troops. He was safe with the troops as far as being safe. And on their way out, his son-in-law, his son, and his nephew were with him. William Crawford, his nephew, his son John, and I can't remember the other one. Anyhow, those 3 were with him. So Crawford, he decided to wait and try to find his relatives. And he was at the back of the troops. He would call their names out. And John Knight, the surgeon, he decided to stay with Crawford. So the troops got separated, and Crawford got separated then because he couldn't find his siblings. So him and Knight started out, and they tried to walk. At that time, they tried to walk away from the battle. And if you realize that back then, if they had GPSs, they would have been safe, but they didn't. So Crawford eventually got caught by an ambush by Delawares, and he was with 4 other guys that they had picked up, 4 other troops. And when they went up to Crawford, they just grabbed him on the arm, and they knew who he was. He knew most of the Indians. He knew Wyandot, the Delaware chief. One of the Wyandot chiefs was Olentangy. There was Dunquat. He was one of the chiefs in the area. And so it was kind of, at that time, he didn't know what was going to happen. Had Crawford been captured by the Wyandots, his fate might have been a little different. The Wyandots, and this is another thing I've read. One book I read that the Wyandots tortured the victims, the other one they didn't. Everything I've ever read before, the one article I read, was that the Wyandots most of the time adopted the end of the tribe. I think that if the Wyandots would have captured him, they probably would have bartered him to the British and got money from the British because, you know, that would have been great for them. They had been supplied.